You are listening to The Upside of Down with Dan Ariely.
Ona, thanks a lot for spending a bit of time with me.
Oh, happy to. We're actually outside of the public library where I used to work.
We're walking around. We'll go to the library soon. It's hard not to observe that you walk in a slightly non-traditional way.
It's a nice way to put it.
And what's the cause of this non-traditional way?
A birth defect, cerebral palsy. Specifically a form of cerebral palsy, which is right hemiplegia. So only the right side of my body is affected.
How does it feel to have one side of your body affected and the other one not?
My left side has full sensation, and my right side feels as though it's been shot through with Novocaine. I can't tell the difference between objects, small objects placed in my palm. You could put a paper clip in my palm or a penny, and I wouldn't be able to tell you the difference unless I peeked.
Okay, you will know that there's something there.
Yes.
But you would not know what it is.
I wouldn't know the specifics of its shape or weight.
And what about just being touched?
It feels different, but it's still nice.
Same? So, you know, for me with the burns, I feel less, but I enjoy it more. So do you know how you can't tickle yourself? You know why?
No, I never knew why.
Because it's about the predictability.
Oh, okay. So you can't catch yourself off guard.
That's right. Oh, where is it coming from? Where is it going? You basically know all the time.
Right.
So you don't have this unpredictability, which is what creates the uncertainty about, like, where is it going? What is happening?
Right. That makes sense.
And for me, the burned skin, the way it grew, it's unclear to me exactly where somebody touches. If I touch you here on the shoulder, you know it's exactly the shoulder. If I move my hand to the elbow, you know where it is.
Right.
On the burnt skin, I don't exactly know where it is. Sometimes it feels like it's multiple places at the same time. Sometimes I don't really know. But it basically creates the element of surprise. And when somebody else touches me, everything feels more unknown. It doesn't intensify the pleasure. It's a little bit more tickling all the time.
Wow.
But in a good way. I enjoy it. So,
one of the perks.
Yes.
Some people like to weigh out. Never see the sky because they're in a big cloud. Here we go, here we go, here we go. The only way up's to push you down. Down, 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 down. I don't even know what that's all about.
Hi, my name is Dan Ariely. And in this show, I talk each time with somebody who's sort of like me in two ways. They've also been through a difficult time in their lives, and yet they're also trying to make specific and interesting meaning and contribution with their lives. I was burned many years ago, about 70% of my body, and I spent about 3 years in hospital. And now I'm trying to run all kinds of experiments about all kinds of aspects of human behavior, trying to figure out what gets us to behave worse and what gets us to behave better. In this show, we will get to have conversations about what we do with all of this. What do we do with our own challenges and injuries? And how do we find meaning? It's about how we make these challenges into better times.
From what my parents tell me, they didn't notice anything right away, except that I was slow to learn things. And so I crawled later. I didn't stand or walk till after I was 2. And when I first crawled, they noticed it was one hand and one elbow. And they just thought it was just a cute quirk. But then when I stood up kind of pigeon-toed. And then they had me assessed, and I had to wear a leg brace briefly.
So you have a brace for a few years?
Yeah, for a good part of childhood, but only at night.
Yeah.
Which was kind of an interesting thing because my mother, she let me skip it. If I had someone sleeping over at my house, or if I was going to somebody else's house, or we were going on vacation. And so I actually wound up with a message that this is to be hidden. And that it could be hidden. I didn't actually even understand that it was visible for a long time.
When you say for a long time, until what age?
6.
So until age 6, you don't know that people can notice that you walk slightly differently and that your hand is...
Right. I mean, I knew I had this thing. I just thought it was private.
But more than the specific, are there different ways that you relate to the world?
It's interesting. I'm a poet and a writer, and I wonder sometimes, you know, you read about left-right brain hemispheres and how the right brain is the creative brain, and that's my undamaged half. So is that why I've never been good at math, but I've always been good at language?
I see. What was your path to becoming a writer and a poet?
There was Mrs. Greenstein in 2nd grade who, at the end of the school year, gave me a copy. It was a paperback copy of funny poems, and inside she wrote, "To Ona, who will someday be a fine author." The year before that, I had a little poem published in the school journal. And then when I turned 12, I started keeping a poetry notebook, very corny, with rhyming poems on purple pages, and I'd sign it with my middle name, which is Fawn, because I thought it sounded like poetry.
What happened later? How did you decide to make this into a profession?
It was actually 7th grade when I thought about, well, what do I like and what am I good at? I always loved when we had opportunities to write in class, and I thought, oh, I'll be a writer. Simple as that. Which, of course, is not as simple as it sounds.
Supernova, dedicated to my parents. Waves peaking in a graceful liaison to rendezvous with oblivion.
When I went to college, I studied literature, and I liked being around visual artists and dancers and painters, and I had a very, very good poetry mentor back when I was at SUNY Purchase, a guy named Harry Stessel. I would bring him poems every week. I did independent studies with him, and he would circle and say, "That's your poem right there," and carve everything else away from it. He said, "Great poems aren't written, they're carved." And then I went to graduate school at NYU in their creative writing program. One of the poets who taught there, Sharon Olds, had a writing workshop that she was offering in a chronic care hospital. And she gave students the opportunity to come and be teachers for the patients there. So we would work with them and take dictation and work with them depending on what they could do.
So you're at NYU, grad school. In addition to writing, participate in this educational teaching in which you go into a hospital, you help people with very difficult disabilities to try and express themselves.
And very difficult life experiences.
Yeah.
Because most of them were healthy at some point, and something happened.
And of course, you know, life in hospital is so aversive and painful, and with so little control and so little safe for the patients. And then you decide to leave academia.
Yeah. I got this idea that I wanted to work with the healthy disabled, was how I thought about it at the time. It didn't have the same heartbreak attached to it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it was in some ways very resonant to me because I used to have to go to physical therapy as a kid at a United Cerebral Palsy. And so it was a way of relating to a part of myself, but baby steps towards it.
But you sounded like your whole life you basically did not think of yourself as having CP, and all of a sudden you start wanting to be close to other people with...
I did, and yet I chose an able-bodied role.
That's right.
The role of helper
Yeah.
and teacher, yes. And then I started stalking people.
Stalking people?
I did. I was living in Greenwich Village, and every once in a while I would see a woman who had some kind of physical impairment, and I would just follow her. I would ask myself questions like, she's nice looking, is she still attractive even though she walks in this way? And if that's true for her, is it true for me? And that's the level it started at. But over time, as I kept this up, I started wanting to know, well, what's her life like?
Their injuries or their disability was very different from yours.
Yeah, even though most of them had CP, it was to a much greater degree and affected them, in some cases, cognitively, so that they needed assistance, not just physically, but in life care skills.
And you were trying to figure out how they live, how they manage, how attractive are they.
Yeah, and what does it say about me? I stalked someone to the point where I actually started a conversation and developed a lifelong friendship. My friend Hope, we met at a poetry event. I was on a panel of readers, and she was in the audience, and she was asking really smart questions. And I liked her in terms of things she had to say. When I was getting my papers together, I looked up, and she was there waiting to talk to me. Told me she liked hearing my poems, and I told her I liked hearing what she contributed. And we went out for tea, and we talked for a really long time, and she also has cerebral palsy.
And at that point, do you think actively about dating somebody with a disability versus not?
Disabled men were not on my radar at that point.
On purpose, or it was just not on your radar?
It was just who I was attracted to was able-bodied, who I was interested, who I was surrounded by. I met my friend Hope right when I was about to marry husband number one. So there was this balance in some ways. I had this world with him where I felt that I had made it in the able-bodied world, and then I could kind of visit the disability world.
How is it to be a friend with another CP? How much of your discussions are about that? How much do you learn from her about coping?
When we first met, it was all we could talk about. It was all we could talk about because neither of us had ever had that conversation before. And so as lucky as I had been in the world of like finding my closest friends who could finish my sentences, nobody ever heard those sentences because I didn't speak them out loud. I'd say for a good solid few weeks, it was like, I have a feeling we have other things in common and we'll get there. But, you know, what's your experience with this? And we really were so hungry for that conversation. And then it receded, you know, and now and again it comes up. But, you know, in the potpourri of everything that comes up in a conversation.
And was it helpful to help you understand your body and what was going on and what is different?
It was helpful not so much about my body as about being in the world socially, because it gave me a place to think about it. Like with how I felt meeting Dan many years later, I could see right away all there was to like and love about Hope, which gave me a little more permission to think about liking and loving myself. Because I think you keep something under wraps for a long time, it kind of affects your whole sense of self.
And was she also living without thinking about her?
Largely, but she was ahead of me in that once we opened that door, she got very involved in disability politics and building a community. I was still going home to my able husband and pretending like I lived in the real world and I visited the disabled world now and then. My first husband was able-bodied athletic. He loved mountain biking and snowboarding and skiing.
All the things you excel in. And your common interests were?
Very few common interests. I had always been attracted to artists and creative men. And here was this guy who was actually studying economics at the time, totally different headspace. And yet he was so affectionate and so interested in being with me. And I felt like here's this guy who, if I'd met him in high school, guys like him looked right through me. So I dove in.
From your perspective, maybe it was kind of a certification from society saying you're approved by somebody who's highly desirable.
Yes.
What was it for him? How did he look at your disability?
Initially, he said he didn't notice it at first.
Did you believe him?
Well, if I was sitting down at the time, yes.
Okay. For me, when people say I don't notice it, I find it a little bit offensive.
You think they're being disingenuous?
Yes. You know, what do you mean? Like, you know, you expect me to notice when you change your hair color or, you know,
and it's supposed to be a compliment.
Wear a new dress.
Right?
And all of a sudden, you're not noticing the fact that I have 70% of my body is covered with scars. Like, you know, how does it exactly work? And, you know, you change color. I mean, things happen. It's not less changing than getting a haircut.
And it's just interesting to me that I think when people say that, they think they're being complimentary.
Yes.
And yet what they're basically doing is negating a big part of your experience.
I think I would like for people to say, I notice it, and over time, it doesn't matter. That will be fine. That will be great. You don't want it to be the main character that defines me. But this idea that, oh, I don't even notice, that's a very, very strange thing to say. How long did it take you to fall in love and decide to get married?
We dated for about 1.5 years, and he was very, let's get married. I was a little less sure because I had this sense we weren't doing that well. But I also had this sense that this was my one opportunity, somehow. But things shifted over time. We were married for almost 10 years, and we lived congenially separate social lives. I liked the independence, that I could still spend a lot of time with my girlfriends while he was off on a mountain biking trip or a ski trip or something, that I, was still me. 6 years into our marriage, we had a child.
How is the decision to have a child? It's a decision, or you just assume that you're going to have a child?
I always wanted to be a mother. I always loved kids. He was less sure, which is part of why it took as long as it did. But as soon as he gave me the green light, like, okay, this is something I want to do.
And what happened when Ethan is born?
When Ethan was born, I had natural childbirth. Everything went well. And then it was time to breastfeed him, and I couldn't hold him properly. If I had him on my left side, his legs weren't supported enough on my right side. The angle wasn't right, and if I had him on my right side, I couldn't get him up high enough. And so the nurses came around and they said, well, we can fix this. We'll put cushions around you. And so they gathered around us and they tucked cushions this way and that, and they got him to the right position. And they're all thinking, okay, problem solved. And I'm thinking, oh my God, 2 days from now, I'm going to be home alone. And who's going to put the cushions
with
under us?
15 cushions. But how do you do this alone?
While I was in the hospital, the first night, my husband stayed with us, so he was able to be my support. The second night, he went back to our house. We had a dog that needed attending to, and I was in the hospital room alone with Ethan, and he hadn't really been eating enough because he was sleeping through when he should be eating, and so, it was a little bit concerning that he stay hydrated, and so he woke up crying, wanting to eat, and I rang for the nurse, and it was a nurse I'd never met before, and she said, nope, it says right here on his chart, he's already eaten. Nothing I did would convince this woman to help me, and I tried everything on my own. I tried to set up the cushions and then get between them. I tried different positions on the bed. I could not feed him that night. We both just cried, the two of us.
Wow. Just
cried and cried, and I'm just like, if we were on a desert island, he would starve. And there would be nothing I could do, and it was such a heartbreaking experience and such a wake-up call that I just took on this physical job, and I better figure out how I was going to do it.
This is very different because I clearly did not breastfeed. One of my challenges is fine motoric.
On both sides?
Both hands, yeah, for different reasons. So I can't use a pencil, for example. But things like changing diapers, washing a kid, lots of those things are actually very, very difficult and very painful, and only...
Physically painful?
Yeah.
What about emotionally painful?
No, actually the only emotional pain was the recognition how difficult it is. I think much like you, having kids was a very clear point of demonstrating my disabilities.
Yeah.
Right? But when you have a kid, there's all kinds of things that you can't not do.
There's this person depending on you. For me, it was a wake-up call, and it also was a real lesson in really understanding what disability is, that it wasn't this cosmetic thing that maybe or maybe did or didn't make me less attractive. It was real physical limitations. Mm-hmm. And I would have to ask for help when I needed it, and I would have to make adaptations. And fortunately, one of the things that a disability like mine teaches you, and I'm sure this is true for you too, is you become a really sort of automatic problem solver.
For me, a lot of it is with technology. I have so many tricks around writing. I use voice dictation, I use software, I use people. Typing is tough. I can type about a page a day, after that it becomes painful. And email is very tough. You know, writing is one thing, but email requires so much. So I have lots of other ways to do things.
So how did you meet your wife?
So this was in grad school. We were on some committee together. We do have a slightly different story about the time we really met each other. And my version of the story is that she was teaching a class on developmental psychology. We were both PhD students. And somehow the VCR didn't work, and my office was next to the class she was teaching. So she knocked on the door, and she asked me if I could help. I got to the class, and I saw that the video cassette player was beta, and the cassette was VHS, was kind of clear. And as she walked to change video, the students were there waiting because it was class time. So I decided to teach them. So I said, "What are you studying?" Developmental psychology. So I don't know much about developmental psychology. So I started teaching them about the visual cortex and jubal and visual, and the experiments I did early on development, and I showed them how it led to Chomsky and kind of ideas about generic grammar. But then she found the tape, she walked into the class, and her recollection is that the students were unbelievably relieved that she's coming back and this guy is talking about stuff they have no idea how it relates to anything. And my memory was that they were deeply disappointed that this, the most interesting lecture that had to come to an abrupt end. That was our first meeting, and then we...
Then you were on the committee after that.
We were in the committee, and then we continued being together. We got married 19 years ago.
When you and your wife met, what was her reaction to your condition? Was it an issue between you at all, or what was that like?
So I think she saw it as a strength of personality that I managed to overcome lots of tough things. Yeah. Maybe she thought it prepared me for married life. If I could be in 3 years in hospital, maybe I could manage 10 years of marriage. I think there was a positive signal there. And in terms of the disability, in terms of the things that I can do and I can't do, I think she looked at it much like you're looking at Dan, as a whole. It's a downside, right? Being with somebody who can't use a pencil or fold laundry or do all kinds of things. But the other thing is, I don't think she really thought long term. One of the challenges, of course, that disabilities are likely to play a more difficult role down the line. 30-some surgeries, lots of transplants. I mean, the odds that at maturity, at old age, I'll be healthy is not very high. There's a hidden cost of disability that can grow with age. When we're young and in love, we don't think about it. Maybe it's a good thing.
I met my current husband in a poetry writing workshop. We both traveled from different ends to Cape May, New Jersey to study specifically with Stephen Dunn, who's a poet whose work I love and Dan in his world loved as well. I got to the workshop table first, and I was feeling kind of groupie-ish and was hoping I could sit next to Stephen and have him on my left so I could hear him well. And much to my disappointment, when Stephen got there, he chose the opposite end of the table to sit in. And then the classroom filled up, and the only chair that was empty was the one next to me. And then this guy came in kind of rushing with a guide dog and sat down in the only seat available next to me, and I later learned was very disappointed that he didn't get to sit next to Stephen because he records workshops because that's how he takes notes. But he also takes notes using a Braille laptop, so he took that out of his backpack and started fiddling with that, and I thought, how much noise is that gonna make? And then the workshop started, and Stephen said, well, I like to have people read each poem twice, and that's especially good now since Dan's here. And Dan said, oh, good. And there was just something in his demeanor that made me kind of do a double take. There was just a gentleness and an openness, and I loved the way he talked to the other writers about their poems, and he said he felt the same way hearing me talk to them.
So he sits next to you. You ask him for coffee?
At the end of the workshop, we walked together to the next event. We talked for a while, and then we'd run into each other, kind of always rushing to one thing or another because it's only a weekend-long event. And every time I turned around, he was surrounded by people. He had this entourage, mostly women, always around him. So he was kind of hard to approach. But at the end of the workshop, he asked me to give him my contact information. And about a week later, I sent him an email just saying, oh, nice to meet you. Hope we can stay in touch. And he didn't check his email that day, but he called me that night. So I thought he was responding to my email with a phone call, but he was just calling on his own. And we talked for 4 hours, and it was really hard to get off the phone. It was just such a natural conversation. It had this feeling of familiarity. I kind of recognized him as the person that I'd always imagined myself with somehow. And as far as the disability piece was, I really found I wanted to talk about it.
And you wanted to talk about it with somebody who...
got it from the inside out.
Who understood disability.
Yeah, but there's something I knew that I wouldn't have to explain and that he would get. When Dan and I first got together, I approached this literary journal called Literary Mama, who had published some of my poetry, and I said, I want to write a column about what it's been like for me to raise an able-bodied child. And they took me on. And I wasn't sure at first whether the story was going to be universal enough that anybody was going to care, because it was so specific to my experiences. But I got emails from women telling me that they could so relate to my experience. It wasn't primarily disabled women. It was a new mother who had twins, and so she didn't have access to both her hands, or just people facing what their limitations are or the ways that they saw themselves as lesser. And I started to realize that my experience was, in fact, universal. It was maybe more acute for me than it would be for an able-bodied person. But it sort of allowed me to think about the bigger world, and that we as people with disabilities actually have something to teach, because we face something everybody either faces or will face.
Any kind of experience of difficulty or trauma is kind of a magnifying glass.
Exactly.
So, if I have to deal with a great amount of pain, everybody has to deal with pain. This just might be more focal, and I might spend more time and attention and thought about this. Yeah, so I do think that disability and difficulty are good magnifying glasses,
yes,
both for what we experience and also for what we should be doing. It's kind of very interesting to kind of figure out what are the benefits of being with somebody who understands you better, and not just one person, like an environment that understands you
community
better, versus fighting in the real world. And you started by trying to fight in the real world?
Yeah, I was mainstreamed. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know at first that people could see my disability because, to me, this was my body. I didn't know other people had more sensation on one side until a little girl said to me, let's walk around like people who limp. So I was like, oh, okay. I tried to copy her, and she said, just walk like you always do. So that was kind of a startling thing to discover. And then I had a gym teacher who said to me, I was trying to run, or I thought I was running. Oh, you don't run. It's more like a skip. Don't worry. Just go sit down. So I learned that there was something visible, but I would quickly forget about it or put it in the back of my mind. But I learned later that I wanted that community, at least to some extent, not to be my whole world, but to be part of my world.
For many years, you didn't think of yourself as having a disability. With Dan, do you feel more disabled or less disabled?
It's not that I feel more disabled, it's that I've invited it in. I've opened the door. If you love somebody with a disability, it's just a part of them, and he moves around in the world with such confidence and agility. I think it invited me to feel the same way.
And you've been together for how long?
12 years.
12 years.
Yeah, and we've only been living together 3 of those years. We mostly took turns who would do the traveling on a given weekend. And there was some real benefits and some real hard things about having that distance. And the benefit was so much conversation, because so much of the relationship happened on the phone. What each of us did before we went to bed at night was get into bed and talk to each other. And also when we would visit each other, the to-do list, for the most part, could stay 100 miles away. So whoever was in the other's home got to kind of take a breath, relax.
And then you decide to spoil all of it and move together.
It's been wonderful. I guess we were ripe and ready for it. It's really nice not to have to say goodbye. I did not like the departure part of it.
Yeah. I am wondering about kind of 2 ways of living. One is a way of living in which you say, I have a disability, but I don't want to keep on thinking about this. I don't want to define me. I'm just wondering what happens when you marry somebody with a disability and now you have to deal with disability-related stuff many more hours of the day. It's hard for me to think about wanting purposefully to increase its role in my life. And you seem to have done the opposite in a very happy, calm, productive and creative way, even in your writing.
It wasn't an entirely conscious decision, though, in terms of, choosing to be with somebody with a disability.
Oh, yeah.
It was this specific person and all the ways in which we resonated with each other. I think there's something about being able to be entirely myself at all time. I used to think of myself as an able-bodied person who was clumsy, and how much better is it to be a person with a disability who does pretty well? I guess I like having disability as a friend rather than as a...
enemy.
Yeah, or an annoying sibling.
One thing that I've been thinking about in terms of moving to a community that has more disability is what is called counterfactual thinking. The idea is that it's very hard for us not to think about other possible states of the world and to compare our happiness to those other states of the world, and that's a driver of happiness. So, for example, imagine that you're missing your flight by 2 minutes or 2 hours.
It's worse if it's 2 minutes.
Why?
Because you came so close.
That's right. And the idea is that in the 2 minutes, you can imagine you would have been there.
Yes.
So you run toward the plane, and you see it leaving the gate, and you see 7C, and you say, I could have been there.
Right.
And you say, if the person in front of me in the line understood what no liquids is, if the Delta person had 1 more IQ point, you basically, you have all these stories about how you could have made it. If you're 2 hours late, you don't have that story. So what this suggests is that our happiness is not really about where we are, stuck in O'Hare until the next flight. It's about how easy it is for us to imagine other states. And if the other states are better, I would have made it, we're miserable. And if the other states are miserable, we're happy. But our happiness is driven by this comparison. There's a beautiful study showing that when you look at how happy people are when they win medal in the Olympics, you would expect the gold people to smile the most, silver less, and bronze the least. But that's not the case. The gold people smile the most. The second are the bronze, and the silver medalists smile the least.
Because they missed the plane by 2 minutes.
That's right. The idea is that, if for 4 years you woke up extra early every morning to do whatever activity you do, to run, to exercise, and so on, and 90 seconds ago you got second place, you can't help but think that Wednesday, 2 weeks ago, when I cut the training a little short, that sneakers I should, whatever you think. But if you got bronze, you're not thinking about 2 steps ahead. You're saying, look at all the people who got nothing. So this whole literature is really about the fact that we are comparative animals in principle, right? And our happiness is very much driven by contrast. And I'm kind of wondering, when you go into a community of people with disability, whether it helps you set up your standards at some level for happiness. And I wonder whether living in a community that has more disabled people across the range gets you to focus a little bit, taking less things for granted, appreciating things to a higher degree, and using this relative judgment in all kinds of ways,
Yeah.
in a way that actually creates higher happiness.
Take time, push the clouds away, watch the sun go down again. The sky tells us who we are.
It's interesting. I know that when I first approached UCP and Goldwater, I could see how able I was and how lucky I was.
Yeah.
Whereas I think now, I don't even think about, well, who's better and who's worse or who's struggling more.
And it doesn't have to be who's better and worse. It's about maybe not taking too many things for granted.
Yeah.
It won't let us die, afraid we make the same mistakes. You better find. It won't let us die.
I see the world as more textured than I used to. And I recognize more the variety of the human condition. It does change and can change on a dime.
Won't let us die, afraid we'll make the same mistakes. You better find your sense of wonder. Won't let us die, afraid we'll make the same mistakes. You better find. It won't let us die.
The Upside of Down is hosted and executive produced by Dan Ariely. The episodes are produced and edited by DGC International and New Fruit Media, especially Luis Dectiar and Colby Goddard. Sound mixing by Ross Nelson. Additional sound mixing, editing, and producing by Daniel Rinaldi. The theme song is A-OK by K-Gems. Additional music provided by Music Bed, APM Music, and Marie-Claire Sedol. I'm Robin Eldridge, and I created, produced, and directed the series. If you like what you heard, please pass it on.
Won't let us die.